Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 42 of the Transgender School podcast.
Today, we're going to focus on the housing crisis, particularly in blue states like California, where the median price of a home is currently $786,000. This is an issue that affects many trans people, as well as the broader LGBTQ community, and really anyone who doesn't have access to affordable housing. Our built environment, the buildings, roads, and other infrastructure that make up our communities, impacts almost every aspect of society in ways that we often don't consider. So the laws that shape our built environment inevitably set the agenda for our lives. Now, to understand our current built environment, we have to go back in time over a century. By 1910, Black Americans owned more land than ever before in the history of the United States, over 14 million acres. This was obviously unacceptable to the white establishment, which rushed to create a web of bureaucratic hurdles designed to limit where non-white residents could purchase homes. These policies are commonly referred to as redlining, which was institutionalized by the Federal Housing Administration and implemented in cities across the country and in California, including Los Angeles and San Francisco.
Yeah, on this topic, I just wanted to bring in some things that I think a lot of people aren't aware of in terms of why our country is so segregated. And I used to teach courses in intercultural communication, so we would spend quite a bit of time on racism, oppression, and discrimination in the United States. And I think I noticed with a lot of my students that they didn't realize that the segregation of the United States was institutionalized and was intentional, and that after World War II, through the GI Bill, that the veterans were supposed to get loans, government loans, to purchase homes, single family homes. And of $120 billion underwritten by the federal government to help veterans buy homes, 98% of those billions of dollars went to white people. So people of color were simply not able to buy homes. They were not supported by the government even after serving in the war. And I think that a lot of people are not aware of this. And the Fair Housing Act didn't become a law until 1968. So prior to that, in these suburban neighborhoods, people of color were simply told that they were not welcome. There was perfectly legal. And where I grew up in Levittown, Long Island, New York, this is something that I think most of us were pretty aware of, that there weren't people of color. It was about 98% white. I think it's still close to that. And that was because of that legacy, that history, where when that town was originally created, any people of color who wanted to buy a home there absolutely were not able to. And so for generations and generations, there was segregation. All the people of color were forced into the inner cities and forced into apartments. And so some of the things that Jackie's going to talk about are very relevant to where we are now and how segregated we are now, how racist and exclusionary our housing is in this country, and how it impacts LGBTQ plus folks today, and what can we do about it. So I'll turn it back. And by the way, I'll turn it back to you, but I highly recommend, it's a little older, but that you watch a film called The House We Live In. I think, Jackie, I probably made you watch it when you were younger, but not made you, because you always cared about these inequities in the world. But I believe it's a PBS film, The House We Live In. It has several parts, and it explains really the history and the roots of the segregation and the blatant racism and discrimination in housing policies that were built into our government and institutionalized, and that we absolutely see the impact of to this day without question. So, Jackie, tell us more.
Thanks, Mom. One really powerful example of these policies is that here in San Francisco, a document called the Residential Security Map was created in 1937 by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. That's a government-sponsored corporation created as part of the New Deal, and this map divided the city's residential neighborhoods into four categories: first grade, second grade, third grade, and fourth grade. Now, these grades were used to segregate the city and were supposed to have been done away with following passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, but a compromise that was struck to get the law passed actually stripped the Department of Housing and Urban Development of most of its authority to enforce it. The result in San Francisco and many other cities was that only 20 to 30% of complaints received any substantive follow-up, and the penalties were minimal enough that they didn't serve as an adequate deterrent. So many cities continued to become even further segregated. In fact, San Francisco's dissimilarity index, which is a measure of segregation, actually peaked in 1970 at 84.5. In 2022, it was 36.2, an improvement, but still far from zero, which would reflect a completely integrated city, whereas a score of 100 reflects a completely segregated city. So even in the 1970s, when we were in the midst of this, queer rights movement here in San Francisco, we were an extremely, extremely segregated city, and we still continue to be, albeit less so, we continue to be a segregated city. It wasn't actually until 1988 that the Fair Housing Act was amended to include some real enforcement mechanisms, but by then, San Francisco's Board of Supervisors had already taken action to lock in the city's segregation via a less overtly racist policy. Rather than continuing to restrict who could buy property in specific neighborhoods, on September 18th, 1978, the Board of Supervisors decided to severely restrict the type of housing that could be built across the city via what's called a downzoning. Now, for some context, before the first zoning codes were established in San Francisco, developers could build apartment buildings of pretty much any height or density anywhere in San Francisco. After all, this is America. So, of course, property owners should be allowed to build whatever kind of homes they want on their land, right? Wrong. As the city grew, it produced its first zoning map in 1921, making apartments illegal in some of the city's outermost neighborhoods. This trend continued over the coming decades, and by 1948, apartment buildings were outlawed in about a third of the city's residential land. The 1978 downzoning, made law by Supervisors Dianne Feinstein, Ron Pelosi, Harvey Milk, Dan White, Ella Hill Hutch, Gordon Lau, John Molinari, and Carol Ruth Silver, was the final nail in the coffin of a fully integrated San Francisco, outlawing apartments in all but a few neighborhoods. This downzoning meant that approximately 180,000 fewer housing units could legally be built in San Francisco, according to an environmental impact report prepared for the law. The report suggested that, quote, as a result, the demand for housing in certain neighborhoods may not be accommodated. Prices and rents may be bid upward as a result of limited supply. Adoption of the proposed amendments may displace low and moderate income and elderly households. Now, Feinstein was mostly honest in her defense of the downzoning, saying, quote, the nitty-gritty of this legislation is to protect single-family housing. And she was right. Countless single-family homes across the city that may have otherwise been replaced with multifamily housing at some point over the past decades, had the rezoning not happened, still stand today as single-family homes, many of them worth well over $5 or $10 million, like the home that Feinstein lived in. But with zoning laws across the state remaining largely unchanged over the following 4 decades, statewide housing production gradually fell from its peak of over 228,000 units in the 1970s to just 68,000 units in the 2010s. This was as our population continued to grow at an extremely high rate. So by 2018, California ranked 49th among all US states in terms of housing units per resident. Between 2012 and 2017 alone, for every 5 new California residents, we built just one housing unit. And California is an amazing place to live for those of us who can afford it. We're the world's fifth largest economy. We have an incredible diversity of natural resources, two of the country's largest ports, some of the most beautiful landscapes in the country. You get the point. Countless people would love to live here. But because we simply haven't built enough housing to match our population growth, we've ended up with that absurd median home price of $786,000 I mentioned, which most people just can't afford. And these issues are not unique to California. These are affecting affordability across the country and disproportionately in blue states with laws providing housing protections for LGBTQ residents. According to a report published by Redfin on May 29th, the typical home in areas with LGBTQ housing protections costs $492,000 compared with $357,000 for the typical home in areas without protections. San Francisco and Portland have the highest share of LGBTQ adults in the country, yet less than 7% of homes in these cities are actually affordable for someone on the local median income. This report also found that over half of LGBTQ homeowners and renters struggle to afford housing payments, and 13% of LGBTQ survey respondents planning to move soon want to relocate to areas that are more accepting. The impacts of this housing crisis go way beyond keeping queer people stuck in unsafe places. Young people across the country are increasingly priced out of the housing market altogether. The median age of a first time homebuyer is now 36, the oldest seen since the National Association of Realtors started collecting data in 1981. Traditionally, first time homebuyers were between the ages of 28 and 33. The millennial homeownership rate just recently passed 50%, but baby boomers had a 56% homeownership rate at the same point in their development, and Gen X had already surpassed 58% by this point. Thankfully, here in California, the state is actually starting to get serious with the housing element process, which requires cities to produce real plans for building the housing necessary to accommodate projected growth and to pass corresponding upzonings, unlike the downzoning that was passed in 1978, laws that would allow for more housing to be built in more neighborhoods across different cities. But as this has unfolded, an older, whiter property owning segment of residents across the state has started to rebel. At one recent community meeting in San Francisco, property owners complained that allowing 6 to 8 story buildings in their neighborhood, which happens to be located in the second densest city in the country, would both lower their property values but also raise costs of living so much that they would displace longtime residents. This obviously contradicts itself, but this contradiction is important because it reveals that NIMBY, which stands for not in my backyard sentiments, are not based on rational concerns. Upzoning a given neighborhood increases land values by allowing far more homes to be built on the same amount of land. And thanks to Prop 13, here in California, property owners can enjoy higher values without a corresponding increase in property taxes. So the real issue here is just that people want things to stay the same. They want the built environment of their neighborhoods, which, let's be honest, were shaped by generations of redlining, and by extension, the people living in those neighborhoods to stay the same. According to a recent thesis by Stanford researcher Jose Luis Gandara, white homeowners' support for an affordable housing project is shaped by the perceived race of its future residents and obviously respondents' racial attitudes. These homeowners use opportunities for public comment at local planning commission and city council meetings to kill housing projects, something that I have witnessed firsthand. I spent about 4 years interning and working for 3 different district supervisors here in San Francisco, and I've listened to countless constituents complain about new development in their neighborhoods. And when it was just me being a good empathetic listener on the phone or in the lobby of a city hall office with no one else to judge them, people often told me the truth, the things they might not say in those community meetings. They said things like, well, people who live in apartments just don't care about their communities as much as people who own their homes. And much worse things that I won't repeat. The thing is that many of these people identify and vote as liberals or progressives. There is a meme that I really enjoyed that kind of sums this up that said, "All are welcome here," says sign in neighborhood where average home is $2 million. And just to drive this point home, San Francisco's wealthy Pacific Heights neighborhood, very liberal, elected Gavin Newsom, Dianne Feinstein, makes up just 2.7% of our population and is one of the whitest communities in the city. That neighborhood made up 28% of feedback citywide on the first housing element rezoning draft. This was the highest rate of participation of any neighborhood in the city, and much of that feedback was not positive about the idea of more apartment buildings in their neighborhood. So if you really want to be an ally, if you live in a blue city or state and you want to help queer people in less accepting areas find sanctuary, find out when and where your local planning commission and city council meet. Check the agendas and show up when new housing is up for a vote. Write emails, make calls, and encourage your like minded friends and family members to engage as well. Find your local YIMBY, that stands for Yes in My Backyard, chapter if you have one, as they will likely already have advocacy opportunities ready to jump into. And the next time someone complains to you about the apartment building going up in their neighborhood, push them to consider why they really don't like it. Ask them, isn't this how we solve homelessness and housing instability, one project at a time? Don't we all have to choose whether we want to be part of the solution or part of the problem? And yes, this especially applies to our older LGBTQ community members who have been lucky enough to become homeowners in blue cities and blue states. Please remember what it was like when you were younger. Consider whether you'd still be a homeowner today if your house had cost 10, 20, even 50% more than you paid for it. So please don't close the door to your community behind you.
As you were saying that, I thought about the first house that we bought was, and you were 1 year old, so we were a really young couple with a new baby, was $195,000. And now that house is according to Zillow $1 million. So that's just in your lifetime. And I marvel at that, and I find it heartbreaking for your generation and younger generations that for us $195,000 was a huge undertaking, and we were terrified about whether or not we were going to be able to make those payments. And we were late 20s couple with a baby, even begin to consider $1 million house, and this is a tiny, very small starter home in California. It's an
Yeah,
example
no,
of
I think
what
it's
you're
I
saying.
think it's a powerful example. And you and dad bought your home in that 28 to 33 range,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's not really available to my generation now,
No.
unless you happen to get super lucky and make a ton of money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that that's it's really powerful to think about how the trajectory for our whole family would have been so different
Yeah.
if you and dad hadn't been able to buy that first home
Yeah.
when you did. And I think that's what's so hard about this and why a lot of property owners push back so much, especially in a state like California where property values have gone up so much, is that if you got locked in before everything got absurdly expensive, before everyone started getting priced out, you're benefiting from this. You're benefiting
Mm-hmm.
from this in the form of higher home values,
Mm-hmm.
rental income if you own
Mm-hmm.
multiple properties. So it's
Mm-hmm.
it's a system that really works for the people it works for, but really screws over the people it screws over, and that group of people is growing as more and more generations get priced out.
Exactly. And I was also struck by, as you were sharing all those facts, that it just feels like, to me, anecdotally, that some of these same people who would do everything within their power to fight an apartment building in their neighborhood are probably the same people who are complaining the loudest about the increase in unhoused
And
people
homelessness, yeah, of course.
on the streets of the cities
Yep.
that they go to for pleasure from their little suburb nearby,
Yeah,
even though they're
yeah.
not actually the people dealing with the unhoused population in the cities in any way, or even confronting it in their own neighborhoods. It's an affront to them, and yet they're fighting against having, obviously, the people who don't have a home are not going to be moving directly into $1 million houses. They need apartments, they need affordable housing. So it's just seems so hypocritical, all of it, to me.
Yeah, it's tough.
A couple questions that
Hmm.
I think people might have, that I know that you've shared with me, or I've read, we've talked about how there are more vacant homes in the US, so homes just
Hmm.
sitting there not being used, than there are people who are experiencing homelessness. I've heard that. Is that true? I think I've heard you say that. But can you confirm that? And how much of this could be solved by more aggressively regulating those home vacancies? Like, who are these people owning these homes that are just leaving them sitting there and seeing how many people have no home? And can we make that more painful for them?
Yeah, so this is a complicated one. The more I've researched this over the years, the more I've realized this is kind of a misleading statistic for a few different reasons. So the first reason is that the highest vacancy rates are in the lowest demand parts of the country, primarily rural areas with not a lot of good job opportunities, and as we've discussed, little to no protections for queer residents. So that's number one. Two, most vacancies are temporary and for really specific, understandable reasons. For example, in 2021 in LA, about 300,000 of the city's 5 million units were vacant. Of those, over 50% were in between residents, meaning someone had just moved out and someone else was probably going to move in very soon. So that's not really a vacancy that you can penalize in any meaningful way. That's going to be some natural vacancy is going to occur as housing units turn over. 10% of those vacant units were undergoing repairs or renovations, 15% were vacation homes, and the remainder fell into a variety of smaller categories, including being stuck in legal proceedings or being condemned. Statewide, California's rental vacancy rate is currently hovering around 4%, which is actually really low compared to a historical average of 5.5% is among one of the lowest in the country. I'm not opposed to vacancy taxes. I think that's good policy. I voted for San Francisco's when it was on the ballot, even though it unfortunately excluded single family homes. But the evidence shows that they're just not the game changer their proponents might claim they are. For example, Oakland has had a $6,000 a year per unit vacancy tax since 2018, but rents in the city continued to rise very steeply until COVID hit. So it's kind of a misleading thing. It's not really a silver bullet.
Thanks for clarifying that, Jackie. I think that's good ammunition for the arguments that we're all going to engage in with people. So when people try to say, oh, we don't need more housing, we just need to redistribute the housing we have, and there's plenty of space for people. No, that's not true, because that vacant housing is not really the kind of housing that's needed or not necessarily available. So those arguments are not really, they don't really have any basis in reality.
Yeah, you have to ask yourself, where is this vacant unit? Why is
Mm-hmm.
this unit vacant? Is it really
Mm-hmm.
vacant long term?
Mm-hmm.
And by the
Mm-hmm.
time you get down to the number of units that are vacant in the area of the people experiencing homelessness and housing instability, and the number of vacants that are actually going to be the number of units that are actually going to be vacant long term, that argument starts to fall apart.
So the truth is, we need more affordable housing, multi-unit buildings, apartment buildings, affordable, and there's no arguing against that. What about, I'm curious about your thoughts, Jackie, about we're seeing a lot of private equity firms buying up homes and turning them into rentals. Is this part of the problem?
Well, it's certainly not ideal to have institutional investors buying up homes, in my opinion, but it's also worth pointing out that less than 2% of single family homes in California are owned by investors with 10 properties or more. Meanwhile, baby boomers, who account for 21% of the US population, currently own 38% of all homes. So young, hopeful, first time home buyers are much more likely to be competing with older individuals who can afford to outbid them or pay cash for a house than they are to compete with an institutional investor.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And I'm curious also, is part of the problem that we're relying on private developers to solve this problem when they probably don't care a lot about the problem as much as they care about their capitalist endeavors, when really it's a human rights issue and we should be looking to the state to step up to support the residents in the state and take care of people. What do you think?
Let's start with the private developers part. Like development has currently stalled out in San Francisco. I think we've approved 4 units of new housing that have gotten permitted so far this year, or maybe that was as of April. So maybe we're at 10 by now. I don't know. I shouldn't speak out of turn there. Opponents of new housing will point to this and they will say, oh, well, look, we can't rely on the private market to provide more housing. Then they'll also turn around and say the private market is building plenty of market rate housing and there's no need to make it easier to build. So they get a little caught up in their own arguments there. But the reality, in my opinion, is that San Francisco lost out on a huge opportunity to grow our housing supply a lot more than we did over the course of the recent pre-COVID growth. I think that the incredibly high cost of rent and property values corresponding with low vacancy rates is evidence of how many people want to live here. But we unfortunately remain closed to new residents who aren't either millionaires or lucky enough to secure the rare subsidized spot or rent controlled unit at a low price. I think the government can and should build as much affordable housing as possible while also implementing rent control measures. And San Francisco, in particular, has been a leader in this space. The city spends more money per capita on affordable housing than any other locality in the country. And the state has stepped up with huge amounts of funding for affordable housing and other subsidies. But in spite of those efforts, as San Francisco has demonstrated, spending huge amounts of money on subsidized housing will help the people who will benefit from that spending, but the demand for affordable housing will always outweigh the government's capacity to build, and the crisis will only continue to grow if nothing else changes, if we don't make it easier to build market rate housing. For example, in Los Angeles, the average applicant for Section 8 housing subsidies waits about 2 years, with some waiting as long as 7 years, many of them experiencing homelessness and severe housing instability during those wait times. Meanwhile, 1 out of every 4 renters in Southern California spends more than half of their income on rent. That's insane. An analogy that I like to make to kind of drive the point home about why we need to allow more market rate housing. So think about televisions and how much cheaper they've gotten over the course of our lifetimes. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, prices for TVs are 99.3% lower in 2024 than they were in 1950. Now, if we'd had laws in place that strictly regulated the size, type, and quantity of TVs that companies could produce, if companies had to go before local governments every time they wanted to build a new batch of TVs and sell them in that community, something tells me we wouldn't have seen a 99% decrease in the price of a television. Obviously, this isn't an apples to apples comparison, but I do think it's an important example that highlights the very real impact a booming supply can have on prices, even in the face of ever-growing demand.
So I'm curious about how gentrification plays a role in all this. Isn't it true that building a bunch of market rate housing in a low income neighborhood will drive up prices and displace longtime residents in those neighborhoods?
So I think this is a really important question. I'm making the argument here, obviously, that new market rate units, unsubsidized houses whose price often places them beyond the reach of lower and middle income households, will still make nearby housing more affordable by increasing the overall availability of housing and relieving pressure on the existing housing stock. This is known as the supply effect. An opposing view, however, is that new housing only attracts more wealthy households and brings new amenities to the neighborhood, including the housing itself, sending a signal to existing landlords that they should raise their rents. This is called the amenity effect or the demand effect. Argues that this would make housing less affordable. In 2021, UCLA researchers conducted a review of 6 relevant studies on the impact of new market rate development on neighborhood rents. 5 of those studies found that nearby market rate housing makes neighborhood rents more affordable across the distribution of income levels, and only one found mixed results. The review concluded that complementary policies such as tenant protection and direct public investments remain essential. Nonetheless, the neighborhood level benefits of market rate development are promising and indicate an important role for both market and non-market solutions to the housing crisis. So this supports my argument that yes, the government can and should be implementing tenant protections while building as much subsidized affordable housing as possible, but that alone will not solve the issue. Absent really large amounts of money in new market rate housing, these public investments will fail to turn the tide of affordability at a larger scale.
In addition to creating affordable homes for LGBTQ people who want to live in more accepting parts of the country, you mentioned and care very much about, of course, solving homelessness, the bigger issue of homelessness overall. Could we really solve homelessness just by building more housing?
Yes and no. So, I mean, it kind of is that simple, but not entirely. So, once you lose your housing, for the cohort of people who are already experiencing homelessness, the longer you spend living unsheltered or unstably housed, the more complicated things get. So, obviously, there's a lot of people experiencing homelessness today who could get back on their feet with the right employment and housing opportunities. But obviously, there's also a cohort of people who will need varying levels of support for the medium to long term. But if we're thinking about the pipeline into homelessness and stopping people from becoming homeless in the first place, the biggest reason why people become homeless is their inability to continue to afford housing. And the data bears this out. States with the highest median rents also have the highest rates of homelessness. California and New York, which boast median rents of about $1,800 and $1,500 a month, also have the 2 highest rates of homelessness per 10,000 residents at 46.6 and 52.7. Mississippi and Alabama, on the other hand, which have median rents of $870 and $900 a month, have the two lowest rates of homelessness per 10,000 residents at 3.3 and 6.5. So while there are obviously other factors at play here, the overwhelming driving factor is housing costs. And the evidence tells us that the best way to drive down the cost of housing is by building as much of it as possible, as close to job centers as possible. Frankly, I think that blue states want to have more influence on the national stage. Blue cities and red states especially want to be more influential within their states. The best way that you can do that is to have more people living in your state. And the best way that you can do that is to actually meet the demand that exists for housing in your state and allow people to move to your state and actually live those values, live the values of that sign that you put in your yard that says everyone is welcome here, even if it means maybe your house is going to be worth $1.5 million instead of $2 million. That's okay at the end of the day. And that's the goal really, is to create more opportunities for people to own homes, for people to have affordable rents, and for people to live in places where they feel safe and accepted and they can have a community.
All right. Well, I hope people better understand the housing crisis overall and how it impacts LGBTQ plus people and what they can do to make a difference, and the hypocrisy in some of the things that people say and think that they understand when they make arguments about why affordable apartment buildings should or shouldn't be built in their neighborhoods. I hope that people who listen to this or watch this have a much better understanding and know how to have those conversations and know better what to advocate for and what policies and approaches will actually begin to solve the housing crisis that we see and that we all complain about, but we don't really understand what to do about. Would you agree with that, Jackie? Any final words?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I made my case. I really believe that we have to do everything to provide those tenant protections. We have to provide that subsidized public housing, but you're not going to make any progress, as San Francisco has demonstrated, in creating real affordability at scale if you don't allow much larger scale market rate housing development. And in a lot of cases, that requires going back and admitting that we made some mistakes in the past, limiting the types of housing that can be built in specific areas, particularly high resource areas, areas with higher property values and therefore higher property taxes and more revenue for schools. We really need to open up those opportunities to more people and not be so exclusive.
Thanks so much for educating us all on this, Jackie, and I hope that people will learn a lot from it and begin to advocate for what you're promoting and the solutions that will actually help with this crisis. Thanks, Jackie, and thanks everybody for being with us again.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Check out your local YIMBY chapter.